Hello and welcome to another instalment of Pole Position on History Hack. This is week 4 and finally it's Alina's turn. Today we're going to be talking primarily about the first mass transport to Auschwitz in 1940, in the summer of 1940. And we've got lots of questions for her. Alina, you ready?
I am ready. I'm actually really excited to finally be able to talk to you guys about my research.
I've
been sitting in the background, so yeah.
Yeah, and you have listened to an awful lot. I've put you through 2 football shows now, lots of boat stuff. So it's about time we did yours. Right, it's a somber subject. Tell us about the first transport. Where did they come from? Mass transport. First of all, right, the distinction is that there were 30 people in the camp before this first big transport came in. So that's why we keep saying first mass transport, isn't it? So tell us about this first mass transport on the 14th of June 1940. Who are they? Where do they come from? And how do they get there? How do they get to Auschwitz?
So let's start with who they were. Basically, these guys were being arrested for various different things. They were trying to cross the border to get to the Polish army. They were caught up in roundups. Basically, the Germans would come in, they'd block off 2 sides of the street and basically take everybody away. They were involved in conspiracy. Some actually, the most horrible thing is they were actually dubbed in by their friends. And I was kind of a little bit shocked when I read some of these. And loads of people were doing this sort of thing. Also, there was action. Sorry, go for it.
I was just going to ask, is this mass transport, is it solely Polish men?
Yes, it is all men.
They're all
Polish men.
Right.
But there was a handful of Jewish Poles.
Okay.
And they were arrested not because they were Jews, but because they were Poles. They were either trying to cross borders, again, roundups, conspiracy, caught for action AB, various different reasons. One actually was dubbed in with a group of friends, funnily enough, and he actually ended up with his friends in the camp altogether, but he didn't survive. None of the Jews from the first transport survived. They didn't last very long, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
Why?
Some of them are very young, aren't they? Yeah, tell us about the age.
Exactly. So we have, in this whole transport, we have 56 who are under 18. We have 440 who were between 18 and 24. And I want to mention the youngest prisoner, who was Stanisław Klimek. He was only 14 years old. And we have some just outstanding evidence about him. They don't actually mention him by name. But for example, when they were boarding the train, there was a prisoner who reminisced about a young 14-year-old boy, because he was a boy.
Yeah.
And he was screaming and crying and in absolute hysterics on the train because he saw his mother.
Yeah.
He was from Tarnów, and he saw his mother. I cannot imagine sending a 14-year-old child, with a group of 728 men I mean, nobody knew where they were going, but it was just outstanding to understand this boy. And he's mentioned a couple of times through different testimonies and different memoirs about a young boy crying and just completely distraught because he saw his mother at the train station.
What did he do? Do you know?
No, he is one of the questions on my research to find out more. I mean, I've only gotten to a certain point in this research, and there's so much more to look at and to go through. And I'm finding new things every day from various different archives around the world. I think, to be honest, I'm going to be working on this for a good another couple of years because it's really interesting. But we also had 6 15-year-olds on there. I mean, these are children. They are deporting children, not just men, but children.
Break down for me. Are they from across like the class strata, or are they all working class people, or is it just indiscriminate?
Completely across the board. I mean, you've got ex-military, you have teachers, you've got labourers, locksmiths, waiters, landowners, farmers, everybody is being arrested, and predominantly they were students.
Okay. So talk to me about, 753 set off from the Jewish bus, don't they, towards Auschwitz? But they don't all get there.
They don't. So on the 13th of June, the day before they actually go to Auschwitz, they all get rounded out from Tabernacle prison, sent to Jewish baths. They were made to bathe, they were given food, and basically prepared. They waited till the early hours of the morning of the 14th, and 753 of them set off. But only 728 arrive in Auschwitz. What happens to the 25? Well, 24 were removed before they boarded the train, and one actually escaped just outside of Krakow. There's conflicting evidence, historians say different things, but I found about 3 or 4 people that have mentioned about the escape from the train. But again, historians, we all argue amongst various different things. But what I do want to tell you about is the way they marched through the streets. So basically the streets were empty. This was in the early hours. There was nobody out on the streets. If people are interested, you can actually Google the photographs of them marching through the street, and you can't see a soul. All you do is see the prisoners marching with armed guards. But what's really interesting is various different things happened. So at one stage, a window opens and a woman waves. And the prisoner who remembered this was like, she was saying goodbye to us. It was quite a somber moment of them marching through the street. But funnily enough, the cousin of my grandfather actually also witnessed this transport marching through the streets of Tabernacle, because my family actually lived there at the time. And he saw his uncle, so my great-grandfather's brother-in-law, marching in this transport. And he was the last person to actually see him alive, because obviously he, for those who follow me on Twitter, know that my great-uncle died in 1942, unfortunately, from typhus.
It just beggars belief. It's so, they arrive in Auschwitz in the early afternoon, don't they? But they don't know they're going there. They don't know what Auschwitz is. And there's already 30 guys there. Who are the 30 guys that are already there, and how do they react to this large transport arriving?
So basically, they're travelling on this train to somewhere unknown. They have no idea where they're going. They're speculating. They go to Austria, they go to Germany, they go for work. Nobody truly knows that they're actually going to hell. And funnily enough, Wiesław Keller writes in his book, when they arrive in Auschwitz, the sign on the train station says Auschwitz Noroświęcim, and because obviously they changed the names. And he asks basically, where are we? Where is this place? And someone says, oh, some sort of shithole or other, which shouldn't really make you laugh at the beginning of a book, but it always does. And then I kind of revert back to this first 30, because that's the next stage of what happens. They see the first 30 prisoners. And I will tell you, nearly everybody will say that these first 30 prisoners look like sailors, because they're dressed in stripes. Nobody knows what these stripes are. Nobody knows what concentration camps really and truly are. They get pulled off the train. They are shouted at. These first 30 prisoners, who end up being the first 30 prisoners of Kappa of Auschwitz, they start beating them. And it's a shock to the system. They have no idea what is happening. Why are they being beaten? What is this place? And then obviously we go through to the registration process, and of course they're being beaten. And it's something I personally cannot imagine. I've stood in the place where they've arrived. I've walked the steps that they've walked, and just not knowing where they are and what is happening. And it's incredible. It's actually unimaginable.
They've arrived somewhere and immediately they're being treated worse than they were.
Exactly. I mean, prison wasn't easy either, but Kazimierz Albin, for example, says, look, I survived prison. I survived Tarnów prison. If I can survive Tarnów prison, then I can survive Auschwitz.
Okay, so what is this speech apparently made by Carl Fritz when they arrive?
So this is debatable by historians. I have my own opinion. I'm going to tell you about my opinion first, but I'm going to read you this speech.
Yeah, tell us the speech, so because people won't know unless they know this subject extremely well. So what is this alleged speech that is made to these prisoners when they arrive?
So they arrive and they're given the speech by Carl Fritz, which basically states, you came here not to a sanatorium, but to a German concentration camp, from which there is no other way out than through the chimney. If someone does not like it, they can go straight to the wires. If Jews are in this transport, they have the right to live for no more than 2 weeks. Priests for a month, Poles for 3 months.
Okay, so 1 second. Who is Carl Fritz?
Carl Fritz is an SS officer that was brought in by Huss, and he is Not one of the nicest people, obviously. I think we should do a podcast on him alone, but that's a whole other issue.
We could, you know what, we could link it in with the Niemeyer brothers from World War One and look at people who ran places like this across both wars. That would be fascinating. But okay, there are immediate problems with this testimony, though, aren't there?
There are. Not everybody says that it happened.
Yeah.
That the speech did happen. There are select prisoners that say that it did happen, but I have a problem with one sentence, which states, "There is no other way out than through the chimney." We are now
tell us why.
Well, this is the 14th of June 1940. They've arrived to not actually Auschwitz the way people see it now. Okay, there is no crematoria.
This is Auschwitz 1, isn't it? This is, so if you've been to Auschwitz, this is not Birkenau, which is with the dual railway lines and the acres of barracks. This is the original, the red brick buildings, and it's very different, isn't it, to what people might immediately assume when they think of Auschwitz.
Exactly. And for example, this place did not look like it did. I mean, it was completely built up by the Poles, that they built it to what it looks like today. But there was no crematoria. There was no chimney. The crematoria didn't go into effect and didn't start working until August 1940, so which is about 2 months later. So could this speech have been? Yes, it could have been, but it was probably phrased slightly differently. The prisoners probably heard from other prisoners. It varies. I am a 50-50 on this issue, if it happened or if it didn't.
So it's a bit like Chinese whispers, isn't it? Okay, right. Conditions in the camp. You've mentioned the beatings, but as they begin to, well, settle as much as they can, these 700 odd men into Auschwitz, how does life play out? What's it like in there?
What is life like in Auschwitz? The first 2 years were absolutely pure hell. Pure, utter, just hell. They would go through daily beatings, the conditions, they had no wet places to sleep. They slept on straw, not even straw mattresses, but just straw on the ground. They would lay literally one next to each other. There was barely any food. The camp conditions were so horrific that I don't understand how people actually survived. They were being exterminated by starvation, by heavy work, by heavy labor. The camp hospital had nothing to help them with. You broke your leg, you're most likely going to die because they've got nothing to be able to help you with. For example, you had the capo, who were incredibly brutal. And for those of you who have listened, I've actually spoken about Bruno Brodniewicz, but I want to basically read out a testimony by Eugeniusz Cyba.
Yeah, do so. Just for people who haven't heard, on the Down the Pub, you put this guy forward as the nastiest villain in history, and you gave us a description of something he did involving a shovel on people's necks and that. But yeah, so for the purposes of a proper interview, tell us what people said about him.
So Eugeniusz Cyba basically states that on Christmas Eve people, 1940, the inmates who work in the kitchen were singing Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, which is the Polish national anthem. Poland has not yet been lost. And one of the Poles basically wanted to report this to the camp authorities. And Bruno Brodniewicz, prisoner number 1, the most brutal, sadistic person, one of the most brutal, sadistic people that I've ever come across, he finished off the informer by taking him to a bath. And I quote exactly what Eugeniusz Cyba says. By taking him to the bath, putting a hose pipe in his mouth and running the water until he died. Brodniewicz did that with other prisoners who were absolutely innocent.
So he just kills for the fun of killing. Tell people about the shovel, in case they didn't hear the Down the Pub.
So one of his favourite things was to basically beat a prisoner to the point of unconsciousness. And he would take a shovel or a broom or anything that basically had a pole, lay it across their neck, stand either side, seesaw until their neck broke.
So, I mean, he is by far the standout sadistic bastard in your research, but he's not alone in terms of Polish capos treating other Poles from this first mass transport like this, is he?
No, I'm going to leave this for my book because he is a Pole. He is not the nicest person. He actually arrives on the first transport, and I spent a lot of time researching into this guy. I've gone to various archives around Poland to try and get more information, because he actually is as stupid as he is during the Second World War, he is a stupid in the communist period, because he actually ends up going to prison twice, which is, for me, I'm sorry that I'm laughing, but just the stupidity of what he does after the war is just ridiculous. But anyway, I will leave that for you guys to read in my book when I finally get down to writing it. So
definitely. Right. Okay. Just before, we've got lots of questions from people. Before we move on to those, what are the statistics like for the first transport? We know that your great uncle doesn't survive, but out of those 728 in the first transport, what kind of numbers are you looking at for survival?
we have a slight problem, because we don't have complete statistics. There are massive gaps in the statistics where we can't be 100% sure of if prisoners survived or not. So from the statistics I have, and I have personally analysed, other historians may have found different conclusions. From my conclusions, it's about 42% that survive.
Okay. STME would like to know, the transportation was from my wife's hometown of Tarnov. Please can you explain why this town was chosen for the first deportation?
We can only speculate. There is no actual official documents to understand why. For me, I believe that Tarnov was the smaller town. Krakow had a much larger prison. However, you've got more people in Krakow, you have more witnesses in Krakow. Tarnov was smaller, and there was less chance of people being able to see what was happening. There could be various reasons. It could have just been chosen because it was right in the middle. So between Zakopane, between Krakow, Rzeszów, Przemysl, all of those basically different places where there were people being incarcerated and where people actually came from the prison. So it could be any of those reasons. And if somebody wants to be able to challenge me on this, I'd be grateful. Go for it.
Yeah, it'd be nice to know, wouldn't it? James would like to know, and I want you to answer this because it highlights perhaps people's, no offence, James, but lack of knowledge when it comes to the early period at Auschwitz. So he wanted to know how many of this transport came from ghettos compared to how many were transferred from other concentration camps.
The simple answer for this, none. That is the most simplistic answer. However, I'm going to just slightly expand on this. They all came from prisons. As I spoke earlier, they were part of Action AB, in English. They were being taken from the borders and all different places. Ghettos were being set up at this point, but they were Poles who were coming to concentration camps.
So how far down the line do you have to go for James before they start bringing in people from ghettos and other concentration camps? Is that much further on in the history of the camp?
1942.
Okay, so for the first 2 years, you're not looking at ghettos and smaller camps being, concentration camps being concentrated in this larger one then?
Well, the first transport of women was actually from Ravensbrück. 999 women were brought in from Ravensbrück on the 26th of March 1942, if I'm not mistaken, and somebody will probably correct me on that. Mm-hmm. And they were actually being brought in from another concentration camp, which was in the Third Reich at the time.
Okay, cool. So that's educated me as well. Thanks for that, James, because I do feel it's important that people understand sort of the evolution of it. Izzy would like to know why there's been so little research on the first transport till now.
I'm going to start with one answer and then I'm going to expand on it. So the simplistic idea is the first transport got the best jobs, best positions. They had the highest point in the hierarchy, in the camp hierarchy. And that is what pretty much every historian says. Yes, it is true. It is completely and utterly true. However, there is so much more we can expand on this. People haven't looked at how these men survived. Yes, they were given great positions. Yes, they had a higher number. They got more respect from other prisoners, from the SS, from Kapo. I don't mean life was easy for them, because it was not easy. I need to really underline that. It was not easy.
I think what it is it gets so much worse after the first transport that the tendency has been, hasn't it, to look at the very worst of it and to overlook these guys at the beginning, because we're not belittling what happened to them at all, but it does get so much more terrible and more unbelievable as the war goes on, which is probably why they've fallen through the cracks.
Exactly. And the really interesting thing is, if you read Pilecki's report, he actually complains about the first transport, where he says that they've taken all the best jobs, and what do we have? We've got nothing. You know, these prisoners that were coming in after the first transport, sir, were getting nothing. They had to have the lower menial jobs and had to work their way up to better jobs and better connections. And there's so much more we can talk about this, but we could do that. We can literally do a whole other podcast just alone on the survival.
Yeah. Okay. Just verify. So Pilecki's a later prisoner arriving.
Yes, he arrives in September 1940.
But he leaves behind copious amounts of testimony, doesn't he, that you can use?
He does. Unfortunately, he was executed by the communists, which is, again, we should really try and get Jack Fairweather. Jack Fairweather, if you are listening, we want you on this to talk about Pilecki, because that would be an absolutely amazing podcast.
Definitely. Okay, Martin would like to know, from this transport, what was the most interesting escape?
Okay, so everybody has their own opinion on this. For me, I'm going to tell you about Komsky, Kuzel, Kuchbara, and Januszewski. They escaped on the 29th of December 1942. And Komsky is quite famous in this whole story. So people who are listening already said, yeah, we already know about Komsky, but I'm going to tell everybody who doesn't know who Komsky was. He and Kuchbara prepped the whole escape. Basically, they made contact with the Home Army, where they organised clothing, they organised maps, they organised food, everything that they would need to be able to escape. And the clever thing is, Otto Kuzel is prisoner number two of the Capo, the first 30 that I spoke of. Again, he himself alone deserves a whole podcast. This man is just incredible. But I'm not going to talk about how incredible he is, because, again, I will ramble on forever. So Otto Kuzel worked for the... my mind has gone completely blank with English. I do apologise. He worked for the jobs section. Apologies if I've used the incorrect wording, because I'm trying to translate.
So he's basically working for the employment agency.
Yes, that's exactly that is the word I was looking for. Thank you so much. I do apologise. And he was quite well known, so everybody knew who he was within the camp, so he could move about pretty freely. And the other three guys also worked in the same office with him. So again, they had a little bit of freedom. They actually managed to collect a whole SS uniform, which is incredible, and managed to hide it, which in itself is incredible. And Kuchbara actually ended up dressing up as the SS officer. He used a torch in place of a gun so that, you know, nobody would become suspicious. He ended up dressing as he was with Komsky. Otto Kuzel hired a horse and a cart with two wardrobes on the back. So they were moving, you know, they could be moving things around for somebody, or, you know, they could invent some sort of story. And they literally rode out the gate. Komsky, Kuzel, Kuchbara, and Januszewski. They just straight out the gate. Nobody stopped them. They passed a checkpoint. They passed the checkpoint pretty well. They abandoned the horse and cart. They managed to reach Libyange, and then they got to the house of Andrzej Harat, who was the leader of the Home Army in Oshenshin.
It's insane. Sometimes it is best to just, when you're doing something like that, like fronting it out is the best way, isn't it? Act like you're supposed to be somewhere, and people will believe that you are.
Exactly, and they just did it. But the really sad thing is, this doesn't really end well for everybody. Komsky ends up getting caught in a roundup with Januszewski. Komsky actually gets sent back to Auschwitz, but he's under a pseudonym at the time, thankfully, and he manages to get himself out, because if he was found out, they would have executed him. He survives. Januszewski, unfortunately, the rumours are he killed himself on the way to Auschwitz, because obviously he would have gone through execution. Kuzel was caught in Warsaw and sent back to Auschwitz. He survives mainly because he's a German. They wouldn't execute a German. Kuchbara, there's conflicting evidence on what happens to Kuchbara. He was sent to Pawiak prison. One of the stories says that his wife came to visit him after he was heavily beaten during interrogation and gave him poison. Another one says he was killed by the Gestapo. So we don't really know what happened to Kuchbara in the end.
Okay. Right, Paul would like to know, My question would be about the people who lived near the camp and those who built/prepared it. What exactly were they aware of at that point of the war? And would anyone truly know how big the whole sordid operation became?
Okay, to talk about this, we're going to have to go pre-World War One. Completely, we're going to have to go back in time. So before World War One, obviously Poland didn't exist. It was taken apart by Germany, Russia, and Austria. At the time, Auschwitz was in Austria near the German-Austrian border. It was an incredible hub for migrants. It was a transport hub. It had railway networks, so you could go to Austria and Germany and various different places. So what the government did at the time is they built wooden barracks and brick barracks. And the brick barracks that we see today is the main camp in Auschwitz. We don't see the wooden barracks because they were taken apart and various other different things. It ended up turning into Bauhof, which was the, again, my complete English has gone out the window, storage department, the Bauhof area. So we've got all these migrants who are living there. Up comes the First World War, the borders get completely moved, and all these migrants disappear. So basically the locals start to move into these places. The barracks, the wooden barracks we're talking about is, if anybody has been to Auschwitz, if you stand with the museum to your back, where you have the hotel in that sort of direction, that's where all the wooden barracks were. So you had people living in close proximity. The army basically take over the brick barracks, so it becomes part of the army, and the wooden barracks accommodate basically the civilian population. Auschwitz gets chosen for its purpose, unfortunately. And on the 19th of June, only a few days after the first transport arrived, the civilian population is forced out. 250 people are deported for forced labor in Germany. The rest are relocated. But we don't talk about the people that were forced into forced labor. They are the forgotten victims of Auschwitz. Even though they weren't in the camp themselves, these people went through pure hell in Germany. They were into forced labor. Half of them didn't survive. If they came back from forced labor and escaped, they were sent into the camp. They lost their homes, they lost their property, they lost everything, absolutely everything. So the relocation does not stop there. On the 8th of July, Zasole, which is the other side of where the camp is, the main camp, these people, again, forced into forced labor. They were basically taken into this big house, and half the people were told to stand on the left, half the people were told to stand on the right. The right were allowed to go home, and the people on the left were basically sent into forced labor. They could only take the most essential items. The houses were either taken apart or reused for offices, or for, in the future, they were used for housing the workers that worked at Monnowice. And these people basically have lost everything. It goes on. The evictions carry on in March 1941, then more evictions and more evictions. And the camp basically, the interest of the camp just grows and grows and grows. Then you've got Birkenau. Everybody was being evicted. There were no civilians in the area. When people ask why, what were all these people doing while this was going on? Well, there was no civilians. There was no people there. Nobody was living in these areas. They were either being deported into the general government. They were either being deported into Germany. The most key workers were kept. For example, if you worked in the mines, you went and were moved closer to Brzeźta or anywhere else that was local that you were needed. It's just unbelievable. These people were coming home after the war to find out everything they had was gone. Everything. Their houses, their farming equipment, their pigs, their cows, everything was taken away and reused for the camp.
I mean, it's a very important point that there's this idea that people might have just watched all this happening around them, and actually they're victims as well, aren't they? Okay, right. Jay would like to know, I've often wondered why in later transports, when some had an idea of what was going to happen, why they didn't rise up Some definitely would have been killed, but the SS would have been outnumbered if the whole camp had rose up against them. What are your thoughts? I really want to hear your answer to this one.
I'm going to give you a very simplistic answer, and I'm going to let everybody make their own assumptions for this.
Okay.
So there was an escape from the SS kitchen by a group of prisoners, and the Kloss brothers were one, and Kazimierz Albin, was another. After their escape, the Kloss brothers' parents were brought into Auschwitz, as was Albin's mother. They used terror. They weren't going to rise up because they feared for their families. They feared for their friends. At the beginning of the camp, if you'd escaped, they would have taken 10 prisoners, either from your work detail or from your barrack, and executed them. That's why they didn't rise up.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward to me. I mean, obviously, they are ruling with terror, aren't they? Zach would like to know, let's just move away from and talk I've got a couple of general questions for you. Zach would like to know, if you could educate people about one little known or incorrectly remembered element of the Holocaust, what would it be and why? I mean, I suspect you're doing this by covering the first transport in the first place, but I know that you feel passionately about other groups that haven't been spoken of as much as the Jews that went to Auschwitz.
Of course, I'm never going to say anything negative of what happened in the Holocaust. I mean, it was a horrific, horrific thing that happened. But we cannot forget the other victims. I mean, homosexuals, for example, they're a very, very small group, but however, they were still persecuted. The gypsies, we seem to completely forget about the gypsies. They were also being gassed in the gas chambers. The living conditions in the gypsy camp in Birkenau was just unbelievably horrific. These people were literally dying of starvation. We don't talk about the Soviet prisoners of war. I mean, the Soviets and the Poles were the first ones to be tried and gassed in Auschwitz in September 1941. We're forgetting how these men were treated. There was 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war went to Auschwitz. And it was something ridiculous, like 100 of them survived. 100 out of 15,000 people. They were worked to death. I mean, some of the memoirs I've read about the treatment of these Soviet prisoners of war makes you sick to your stomach. And this was only in 1941 and 1942. They were the ones building Birkenau. We also forget about the Poles. Again, this is what I am doing, exactly what you've said. This is exactly what I am doing right now. And I'm trying to make people aware that there were Poles. They were the first. They went through hell. They may not have been exterminated, but they were exterminated in a completely different way.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree. I want to ask you, actually, there's huge contention, isn't there? And obviously Auschwitz is in Poland, but it is completely incorrect to refer to Polish concentration camps, isn't it? It's considered offensive.
It is considered offensive because they were German Nazi concentration camps at the end of the day. Poles were victims within these camps. And people need to make sure that the terminology is right, because you cannot mix up a victim with a perpetrator. And this becomes, I'm not going to discuss it in detail because it becomes very political and it's incredibly damaging around the world to people. And people need to be aware to use the word German Nazi concentration camps. They were not Polish. They weren't even on Polish territory. It was on Polish territory that was annexed into the Third Reich. Poland did not exist at the time.
I had to ask that because I know you're embroiled in one of your Twitter rails at the moment over it. Red would like to know, it says, Alina, I'm currently reading the amazing story of Witold Pilecki. Who from this era would you choose to write a book about?
Well, simplistically, my grandfather, because he's just awesome.
He was the general in charge of the defense of Lvov, yeah?
That's actually his father.
Okay.
So actually, yes, I would probably write a book about both, because the general in charge of Lvov and also my grandfather, who was in the Warsaw Uprising, and he was also a soldier during the occupation, and he did all sorts of incredible actions and executions and all these sorts of things that just seem like a movie, basically. It's just a film in my head. It's incredible. But the other person I would, and I is something I'm really incredibly passionate about, is the Otto Kuzel that I mentioned before, the prisoner number 2 who arrived in the first 30. And he is just an incredible human being, and he has had no recognition in historical literature in academia, and he's actually one of my next projects that I'm going to be working on, because he deserves a huge platform. And if his family is listening to this, please get in contact, because I would love to be able to talk to you.
I love it. Please do contact her, because then she'll stop complaining about how she doesn't know you to me. You're chosen out, right? This is a serious question. I mean, you are bonkers. But let's explain to people why that might be. So your chosen area of history, it's deeply interesting and it's important. And like you say, people need to know this stuff, but it is harrowing. I mean, I do the First World War. I wouldn't touch your subject with a barge pole. Just the sheer cruelty that humanity inflicts on itself in this. How do you not let it get to you? I mean, you've got a black sense of humour, let's not lie. And soldiers have that, and First World War historians have that, because you have to find a way to process it. But how do you stop yourself from becoming absolutely bogged down by the inhumanity of all of this?
I'm not going to lie, I've had moments where I've literally put books down and said, no, I'm leaving this for a week. I just can't do this anymore. I do suffer from nightmares. It's something that just comes with the job at the end of the day. But I have outs. So I have really great friends like you, Alex, who make me laugh. I listen to comedy. I go out on the motorbike. The motorbike is one of the most amazing therapies you could ever think of. You go to the gym, you get out of being in the house is the worst possible thing. You get out of the house, you do things, you go out with friends, you live life. And I live life, because what I read, life is short, life is cruel, it is brutal. So why not live it?
I mean, we started this podcast to stop you from going mad sitting in your house, didn't we? Let's have a couple of light-hearted questions. Steve would like to know, which famous historical motorcycle enthusiast would you like to go on a ride with, and why? Would it be Lawrence of Arabia, Steve Mcqueen, Evel Knievel?
Do you know, I actually misread the question the first time round, and I wanted to say, Guy, why has my mind gone completely blank to this? I want to say Guy Walters. It's not Guy Walters, because it's...
I'm just going to say Lawrence of Arabia, no, because his track record of staying upright on a motorbike speaks for itself. So rule him out.
Well, Steve Mcqueen is pretty cool, because he does all that amazing stuff in The Great Escape, which obviously was kind of... didn't the guys they did a program about it, didn't they? And they completely dispelled that it was possible.
Either that, or we did kind of dispel it as impossible when we talked about Nazi conspiracies with Guy and Luke as well. Did. But Steve McQueen,
I think it'd be Steve McQueen, because he looks pretty cool, and I like him. So it'd be Steve McQueen. Let's go with Steve McQueen.
I'm pretty sure you'd have him riding behind you, though, because I know you. Right, you are sitting in a Hollywood producer's office, right, discussing which actress is going to play you and me in the film The History Hack. Who would you choose to play you? And it says, for your information, if there is a cameo, because Steve asked this, our artwork person, if there is a cameo appearance for the drawing guy, he'll take Robert Downey Jr., Jack Black, or the guy who plays the Hulk before he turns in the Hulk. Just saying. I think that's a little bit of wishful thinking. Who's going to play you?
Do you know what? I can't answer this question, but I can answer your question.
Oh, you're going to cast me?
I'm going to cast you, because
all right, and then I'll cast you. Myself. Go on then.
Right, okay. You ready?
Yeah.
Megan Fox.
She can't act, man. She's terrible.
Yeah, but she's really pretty. Okay, fine. If we're going to talk about actresses that can act, we'll do Sandra Bullock.
Are you serious? She's like old enough to be my mum. Right, in that case, I'm casting Dame Maggie Smith as you. She can ride a motorbike. Or Judi Dench. Judi Dench, if you're listening and you'd like to play Alina in a biopic of her life, get in touch.
Do you know what? They are incredible actresses, so I'm going to take that.
Everybody we've mentioned, apart from Megan Fox, is an incredible actress. No offence, Megan, but you didn't get cast for your skills. Alina, this has been brilliant. I've learnt loads. I think it was really important that we gave you a platform to talk about what you do. And obviously there's so much more to be said about the Holocaust on History Hack at some point, and some of the characters you've mentioned. Who do we have next week on Pole Position?
Next week, we actually have a friend of mine, Juliet, who, Breton, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, because I might be completely incorrectly pronouncing it. She's a journalist. And we're going to be talking, if I'm not mistaken, about the Polish tango. So we're going completely out of the box for next week because, do you know what? We've had enough of World War II. So let's
We have
do
done
something
all
else.
World War II so far on pole position. So is she actually talking about dancing?
We probably will be, but she will correct me if I'm completely wrong, and we will retweet the correct answer.
Excellent, cool. Well, whatever she's going to talk about, she's very knowledgeable on a number of subjects. We look forward to it. Join us later on today when we will be launching a bit of an oral history initiative on History Hack. We have Peter Hart and Gary Bain. It's a mashup with Peter Hart's military history. It is quite frankly insane. Somewhere in there are some fantastic lessons on how to use oral history, how to coax the best information out of people, how to tell what's reliable and what isn't. There's some great lessons in there amongst the chaos. I'm warning you now. And then tonight we go down the pub. This was Alina's worst nightmare when we taped this last night. We played historical fantasy football. We spent nigh on 2 hours trying to decide who would be on the greatest football team in history, and came up with a team that I picked and not even I agree with. So tune in, because we talk about lots of players. We also have a lot of fun on that programme. Probably don't listen if you're Roy Keane or Steve Bruce or Ryan Giggs, because we weren't really that nice about you. Until then, stay safe. If you possibly can, stay at home. This is Nighthawk signing off.